just start the recording here and get the PowerPoint up. Here we are. Here's just another reminder that you have a second paper coming up at the end of October. That's just 2 weeks away, really, and a little less. So please be working on that. Assemble your thesis idea. And Daryl Pulls has some tools there that you can look at under File on the Populi site for this class. Get a thesis sentence and then support your thesis sentence with things that you have researched. And then write a little conclusion, and be sure to spell check afterwards. Just run it through so that there are not a lot of red marks on your paper. I hope I haven't discouraged you by that. If you have had a number of them, I'm trying to help you just understand the importance of that so that when you go on to a four-year university, you'll be prepared. So, but I love your ideas and I really enjoy interacting with you in the paper. If you have questions, what are you going to write on? You don't know, contact me and I'll give you some ideas. Any person who comes up in these lectures would be a good, or an event sometimes. Try and narrow it down. Don't write on Luther. He's too huge a topic. Yeah, there are more people have written on Luther than any other single person aside from Jesus. So limit this and keep it limited to something quite narrow, and that will help you out a lot. So last week we talked about three pre-Reformed figures: Peter Waldo, John Wycliffe, and Jan Hus. And these were in different centuries. Actually, Wycliffe and Hus overlapped a little bit, but you can see that these were happening in different parts of the world, different parts of Europe. And Peter Waldo was a merchant, but he was not a scholar. And yet these three had similar ideas because they read the scriptures and they found that what was going on in the church at the time wasn't right. And they had the boldness to be able to preach it and speak it. And there was resistance. Today we're going to move directly into the 16th century and the context in which Luther and Calvin's reform took place and the Anabaptist reform. All of that was the 6th century. We call it the 16th century reform. And it was not isolated like Huss's or Wycliffe's or even Peter Waldo's, but it was widespread. It was throughout Europe. All these ideas were spread throughout Europe. So it became really a hinge of history. I just want to say a few things about this reform before we launch into the discussion. In recent past, scholars have tried to look at history uniquely through economic or social lenses. And so they looked at the reform and said, oh, this is just an economic or social upheaval, or even moral. But this is partly true. We saw that when we looked at Matt Tyler's Peasant Rebellion in England in 1381. But more recently, scholars have come to embrace and recognize that what happened in the early 16th century was profoundly religious. It was a deeply religious discovery. They began to understand that religion can be at the heart of the culture and can change the way a culture acts and reacts and functions. That what we believe is deeply important. Luther and the Reformed theology that followed a generation later with Calvin was hugely important to what was to happen in Europe in later generations. And I find this particularly interesting for France, which you know is a country I've spent many years in and love. France had a very bloody and revolution that was a few years after the American Revolution. But many are saying today it was bloody because France repressed the reform, the religious reform. As a result of that, when revolution came, it was bloody and tyrannous in nature. It went right from the Renaissance to a bloody, tyrannous upheaval in which many, many people died. Whereas in Northern Europe and in England, reform in the church came first, a theological reform of ideas. And that's why many Chinese scholars who have long wondered why the West moved ahead of the rest of the world recently concluded that Christianity was the reason for the dominance, or is the reason for the dominance of the West. Not economics or weaponry or Europe's form of government. Tell me something. Can you all hear me all right? Yes? Okay. So this is an interesting thought, once more, that religion was at the center of what caused not only a religious revolution, but an economic and philosophical revolution. But it does lead a question. I wonder if we could just spend a minute on that right now. And that is, why do you think the religious revolution of the 16th century also brought along with it huge social transformation and freedom? Why do you think that is? Why would ideas that are profoundly religious in nature also touch the economic and social life of a continent? Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Because if the way the way the culture believes differs, and that touches every part of their life, how they interact with their customers. For instance, if they're in the economic realm, and in the social realm, how they interact with families, with friends, and how they worship is changed, the culture is changed.
Okay, so we're saying that culture is right at the heart. Yeah, Liz, yes.
I would say that these ideas changed and impacted the secular world because even though they were religious ideas, the religious world, to put it that way, is still part of the secular world. So whatever is going to change us in as in like the church is going to be reflected into the world and how we act towards it, and how we interact with the world as well.
These are complicated questions. Yeah, Tim. Yeah.
You can also think of it like how if you're a business owner, right? If you're Catholic and before the Reform, you can buy an indulgence from the Pope and you don't need to worry about how you're running your business, how it reflects on religion, how it reflects on God and what you believe, because you just buy an indulgence, you're fine. But when that actually matters, your behavior changes. You start running your business like it matters, trying to treat your customers right, trying to do the right thing, and just in generally doing better. So that helps the economy. And the same in social life, when you're called to start bettering your anger, where you're not arguing with people, you're not having fights with people and getting revenge on people or getting angry with people, having all this animosity with other people, when you're called to forgive and forget and to work with people. That changes how you act around people as well. So it completely changes everything in culture when you change religion.
I like that a thought, Tim, that this has an impact on your moral life, your honesty, how you run. So a couple of you mentioned how you run your business. We hope, anyway, it does. When people are genuinely indwelt by the Holy Spirit, to recall what Mariana had said a couple of weeks ago, really struck me. The Holy Spirit comes into a believer when they hear the good news. That Holy Spirit begins to grow in them a different kind of life. I remember when I was in France many years ago, a lady who had been raised Catholic, and here again, I don't want to paint the picture black, particularly today. I really have a lot of admiration for the current Pope, and there are many great thinkers in the Catholic Church whose writings we still read and love today. But this particular lady had said it changed everything when she became a Christian. Well, a Protestant Christian, a believer. She said suddenly it wasn't just some kind of an outside thing, set of rules I needed to obey, but something was inner, an inward set of rules, of guidance by God, making all the difference. He said, if anything, it's harder. One of you mentioned, all I have to do is buy an indulgence or confess and I'm okay. People used to tell us how people would be sitting in the pub near a Catholic church, and when the host was raised and he is saying, "This is my body broken for you," there's a little window in the church, and all the people in the pub or cafe would stop and look up at that host, because if they saw the host lifted up through the little window in the church, they were all forgiven. So it became something mechanical rather than inward. That changes, but it also gives a certain amount of freedom. Now, those are subtle kinds of things. I'm not sure I understand it completely, but a sociologist named Max Weber in the early 20th century talks about the Protestant work ethic. People worked harder. They saved. They were more conscientious. And it touched the whole pattern of life. So moving along, what do we know the church was like at the dawn of the Reformation, the early 16th century? What was it like, the church at the dawn of the 16th century? I think we talked about that last week, so I'd just like to go on a little further right now with that. And do a kind of a review, because today I really would like to look at what was the whole moral climate of the church in the early 16th century. So I'm not there yet. What I want to talk about by way of introduction to this subject is a conversation between two very widely known and respected scholars of the late 14th, late 15th, early 16th centuries. John Colet was from England, and Erasmus was from the Netherlands. And these two people were having a conversation. It was around the spring of 1512, before Luther, before his 95 Theses. And they had decided to pay a visit to the shrine of Thomas of Becket at Canterbury in England. Remember, I don't know if you remember the story. I'll try and just refresh your memory. Thomas of Becket had been Archbishop of Canterbury, and in the 12th century, he refused to obey King Henry II, Plantagenet, and prosecute monks and prelates as heavily as the king wished for crimes of murder and rape and thievery. Remember, this was the struggle between the king's law and the church's law, the king's law and canon law. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had actually been a longtime friend, or Thomas of Becket, who had been a longtime friend of Henry II until he became the Archbishop, refused to obey King Henry II and prosecute these monks and prelates as heavy as the king wished for crimes of murder and rape. It was a struggle between the authority of the king and the authority of the church. And later, Wycliffe taught that the king should have authority to prosecute felonies alone. We saw that last week. Remember that? Wycliffe said, when he came out in the 14th century, he said, look, and he was an Oxford Don, he said, look, the king alone should levy taxes. The king alone should prosecute for crimes and felonies, not the church. But at this time in the 12th century, around 1100, and a little late mid 12th century, there was this struggle going on between the king and the church about who had the rights to these taxes and prosecution. And the king was so upset by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Becket's refusal to allow the king to prosecute these people as they ought to be prosecuted, that he, in a moment of exasperation, said, he is a traitor who would allow this man to go on living. And immediately some knights got up, that he was in France at the time, and they crossed the channel, went to the Cathedral of Canterbury. They found Becket. They tried to give him an opportunity to escape. He wanted to be a martyr, and so they killed him. Immediately, the Pope made him into a martyr. They built a shrine around him, and people started coming to this shrine from all over Europe. It became the greatest shrine in England. There was revenue that came to it from all over Europe. People would throw in jewels and gold and silver into this shrine, kind of like throwing pennies into a fountain today, I guess, hoping that they would get a blessing by contributing to it. So here are these two scholars, John Colet, and he was an Englishman who was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral and founder of its new school. And the other was a Dutchman named Erasmus. Both of them were deeply religious men. So, and both of them deeply pious. They wanted to live their life for Christ. And when they came to this shrine, they were staggered by the treasures that they saw. Erasmus found them disproportionate, treasures before which Midas or Croesus, two ancient Greek kings, would have seemed beggars. Some 20 years later, Henry VIII would cart away from this shrine nearly 5,000 ounces of gold, 4,500 ounces of silver, gilt 5,000 ounces of plain silver, and 26 cartloads of other treasure. But they looked at this treasure, and Colet asked of the cleric showing them around, he said, "Is it true, good father, what I hear? That Thomas of Becket in his lifetime was very good to the poor?" "Most true," replied the monk. "Then I do not suppose his dispositions changed, unless for the better," said Colet. The guide nodded in agreement. So Colet asked, "Do you think Thomas would mind if some poor woman with starving children at home or a husband laid up with sickness were to take some small part of these great treasures as a gift or a loan? The monk in charge of the hoard made no reply. Then Colet said in a loud voice for all to hear, I, for my part, am quite confident that the saint would even rejoice to be the means in death as in life of relieving by his riches the destitution of the poor. So here they are, they're looking at this huge treasure, and this is a kind of moral emphasis, isn't it? The wealth of the church and of this shrine, and what should actually be happening to this money? Shouldn't the poor be helped by it? What's the church doing collecting it? The monks then took them around the choir of the church and began unlocking the relics so that they might kiss them. Now, this is where we get theological more. There were some 400 relics at the shrine, including 2 teeth of St. Alban, a cutting from St. Cuthbert's beard, 11 holy arms, and 3 hands. Imagine that. Colet recoiled in disgust when invited to kiss a prize relic, the arm of St. George, a grisly bone with bleeding flesh still clinging to it. When the prior of the shrine, Goldstone, opened a black leather case in which were some soiled and torn pieces of linen cloth, parts of a handkerchief once used by Becket to wipe the perspiration from his face or his neck, the runnings from his nose or some such thing, and offered a piece to Colet as a great and generous gift. Colet gingerly took it at arm's length and with a whistle of repugnance dropped it back into the box. So this is England, this is Europe at that time. This is what's going on. This is religion for them. 2 miles further from town, outside an almshouse, 2 men were confronted with a license to beggar. The guys could get a license to be beggars. And this beggar showered them with holy water and offered St. Thomas's shoe to be kissed, Thomas of Becket's shoe. And Colet asked, what? Do these asses imagine that we must kiss every good man's shoe? Why, by the same rule, they might as well offer us his spittle or dung to be kissed. Okay, so these guys are looking at this and saying something is deeply wrong here. Not only we're not using this money that ought to, but what are we doing kissing shoes of saints or people who had died? What are we doing? They were calling also together something theological at the bottom here too. So who are these guys, Colet and Erasmus? And it's important to ask the question because they were part and parcel of another thing called the Renaissance, deeply rooted to the Christian faith, incidentally. Scholars like to separate the two, but in fact, this was the Renaissance was deeply rooted in Christianity. So what do you know? What do you know? What's the Renaissance? Who can give me a little idea of what it is and what it was and why it was important? What was the Renaissance? How about you, Grace? Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, it means like rebirth or something, doesn't it? Like
It does.
going.
Indeed, yes. Rebirth is the meaning of the word. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was kind of like a time when, like right after the Middle Ages, when they were kind of looking back towards, I've always heard it as they were like looking back towards like the Greek and Roman times and trying to like kind of go back to that in like art and architecture and like schools of thought and stuff like that.
Exactly. Very good answer. They were rediscovering Greek and Roman literature and thought. And they were also studying the ancient languages, not only Greek and Latin, but Hebrew and Greek. They wanted to get back to ancient times and find out what was really going on back in other times, with the thought that maybe these guys have something to teach us. Of course, this at first started by, well, he's Boccaccio. That was in the 14th century. This was the Renaissance really started in Italy because they were a little wealthier. They had a lot of trade, Naples, Venice, and so forth. These were all trading states, city states, and Boccaccio was part of one. And he wrote a book called the Decameron. And so he was one of the first representatives of the Renaissance. But there are other reasons the Renaissance were important. And as you know, the printing press was hugely important. Johannes Gutenberg invented it in 1450 and printed his first Bible in 1455. Up to this time, if you wanted to read somebody from ancient Greece or Rome, if you didn't have a copy in the nearby monastery, you might have to travel all the way across Europe to find the one copy that existed in somebody's library in a monastery in Switzerland or Hungary or who knows where. Now the printing press, all of this was being made available. Knowledge was widespread. Hundreds of books could now be printed. So this is one reason why the reform could take place. There's another reason for the Renaissance. Oddly enough, it's the fall of Constantinople. Why would the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks? Remember, the Crusades held back the Seljuk Turks and the other Turks for 350 years. And finally, Constantinople fell. This was the ancient Eastern Byzantine Christianity. So why? Well, I don't know that you would guess this, but think about it. Why did the fall of Constantinople help to be a kind of help the Renaissance take a leap forward? Any ideas? Tim?
The only thing I can think of is the thought that since even Constantinople, which had stood for so many years, if even that could fall, maybe it would be better just to spread the learning out among everybody. So if a major place of learning fell, not all the learning fell. Not all knowledge was lost.
Not all knowledge was lost. You better spread it around. And you're kind of touching the edge of this a little bit, Matt. But Tim, what did you want to say?
Well, if they were so concerned about the, Islam trying to move further into Europe, that could also be a reason to advance technology. I mean, Renaissance is around the time they started really working on firearms, if I remember right. Handheld firearms, that is. And also, I believe they would be right next to a lot of new and interesting culture, and that would probably bring a lot of trade if they weren't immediately fighting with Islam, since Islam probably had a lot of different ideas and culture to trade with.
So contact with these other culture might have stimulated trade and thought in some ways. I think those things are true, and I think there was a lot of inventing going on in the Renaissance period. Actually, during Luther's time, the Ottomans came right up to the walls of Venice, and it's a miracle of God that Venice was not captured and by the Ottomans, Turks. Henry IV, or Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire had to stop them. But one of the things that helped the Renaissance by the fall of Constantinople was that there were hundreds of scholars who fled west to Europe rather than be be under the hand of these Turks. And they brought with them thousands of documents. And suddenly scholars were reading these. And they were also saying, wow, there's another form of Christianity that we knew very little about that has different liturgies, different practices than those in the West. And they go all the way back to the time of Jesus. So hadn't we better return to the original? Be reading Greek? So this not only unsettled the people in the West, but made them think, there's other stuff out there. And scholars, people who like to study, were absolutely exhilarated. They began to explore ancient writings and call into question a lot that their church had taken for granted when it was a monolithic, one church tells everybody what to do. And here's what they started saying, wait a second. This may not be true. Maybe we should rethink some things. And a lot of the classical authors placed great value on the idea of freedom, the belief that people are autonomous beings responsible for their own actions, gifted with reason and inclined toward virtue. And they began to wonder whether humans could make whatever they willed of themselves. So here's a little speech. It came 100 years later during Shakespeare's time, but it's a line from The Tempest that helps to kind of exemplify this whole idea of the Renaissance. Oh, wonder how many goodly creatures there are here, are there here. How beauteous mankind is. How, oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Suddenly, they began to think, we can move this giant monolith that's the church, and it's kind of what's that in wrestling, that kind of, you have a lock on people, on our cultures, and think in new kinds of ways. Suddenly doors were open. They began to think. People began to question the whole medieval system and hierarchy, the idea of total submission to the Pope or an abbot or the church, and all the mechanical religion of penance and relics and absolution performed upon them by a corrupt clergy. It all seemed wrong. They began to have the courage to say, this is nonsense, and to be able to prove it. How do they prove it? Well, here's an example. I think we mentioned him briefly. Lorenzo Valla, who is Italian, and Nicholas of Cusa, Italian, worked together to examine the donation of Constantine. We talked about that early, in which Constantine had supposedly given authority over the whole of the Roman Empire to the Pope. Constantine hadn't done that. This was a forgery that had come some 300 years later. And Lorenzo Valla and Nicholas of Cusa, by studying words that were used in each period of time, said, this can't be. This document is from another century. Nobody in Constantine's time would have acknowledged, would have used that vocabulary. So they were using something called philology, or a study of language. And their writing was so compelling that even the Pope recognized that it was true. So coming back to Erasmus now, Erasmus was a Dutch scholar. He had grown up as a member of the Brethren of the Common Life. He was the illegitimate son of a priest. He wrote a book called In Praise of Folly. It was a satire of the church, and it was a bestseller. And he also most importantly, edited the New Testament Greek. He got all the documents together to make a Greek New Testament so that scholars could read not the Latin, but the original Greek of the New Testament. That was simply huge. The Brethren of the Common Life, their motto was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he was all his life a person who attempted to be kind and loving. He was immensely learned, and he wrote with a crystal clear style. So he wrote his book In Praise of Folly, and this was a satire on theologians, which made the church furious. He was poked fun at theologians throughout the theologians and priests and so forth throughout his whole book. And the church was not happy with this. And so, anyway, his greatest work was this New Testament, the original Greek. And he published it, he said, for this reason. Remember that in John's Gospel, some Greek Jews had said to Philip and Andrew, "Sir, we would see Jesus." And the main motive of Erasmus was to answer this cry of the common man, we would see Jesus. He wanted to get through all the apparatus, the mechanics, this stuff, the sacraments, so they could get right to Jesus. He said, he wrote, I would have the weakest woman. Listen to that, girls. Erasmus was pushing for women to read. I would have the weakest woman read the Gospels and the epistles of St. Paul. I would have those words translated into all languages so that not only Scots and Irishmen, but Turks and Saracens might read them. I long for the plowman to sing them to the traveler, to beguile with them the dullness of his journey. These sacred words give you the very image of Christ speaking, healing, dying, rising again, and make him so present that were he before your very eyes, you would not more truly see him. This is the love of the Gospels, and he wants everyone to be able to read them. It was this annotated Greek New Testament, based on the best manuscripts available, that Luther studied and used for the translation of the New Testament into German. As this quote I've just said underlines, these scholars, these Renaissance scholars, were not atheists. They were Christians with a profound desire to live their Christian lives more truly, simply, and honestly, and to see Jesus more clearly. So here's a question. Enough talk from me for a while. I'd like to hear from you. We've already seen in Waldo, Wycliffe, and Hasse, now with Erasmus and Collett and so many other scholars, this great desire to move the church back to its original documents. But can we not counter that God could indeed reveal new truths through the Pope as years went on? And that new revelation could change to some extent the original expression of what God intended for the church? What basis do we have for believing that our faith should conform to the Bible and not the Pope's teaching? Why not new revelation? Growing out of the first. Tim.
Well, it says in Jeremiah that the heart is deceitful above all things. And it also talks plenty about false teachers and false teachings in the time of Revelation. Jesus says that it would be better to have a millstone hung around your neck than to lead one of the little ones astray, right? So we know that there's going to be false teaching. We know it's going to be convincing too, because the Bible talks about many people being swayed to it. And I mean, that's happened plenty with stuff like Gnosticism that we talked about before. And knowing that, and knowing that there could be plenty of false teaching coming, and there could be plenty of it that's really, really subtle, really misleading, really hard to notice and realize that it's wrong. Well, you go back to, what can I trust? So you can't trust just a regular person because heart is deceitful. So who do you trust? You trust Jesus. And Jesus, all the words he said can be trusted because he's Jesus. The words of his disciples can be trusted for the most part because they were the closest to him and the most affected by him. And the words of the scholars before him, even Jesus trusted, so you can trust what Jesus trusts. So going back to the Bible and all the original text that we have and everything that lines up with that text, it's sort of safe. That's what you can know for sure is correct.
Good. A good synthesis, a good summary, Tim. I appreciate that. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that subject before we move on? I'm realizing that I have a lot more. I'm only at the beginning here, so maybe we better. I also wish we could talk about this subject. And is Mariana there? I got a question for you. I don't see everybody.
Yeah, I'm here.
Mariana, what relationship do you think we as Christians, what idea we should have towards scholarship in the Christian faith today? I mean, obviously, a lot of people back in the Renaissance were very distrustful, the church of people like Erasmus and Colet and subsequently Luther. And these were scholars, above all things. What should be our attitude towards scholarship today? Should we trust it? Or should...
Well, I believe that when, for example, when we go to church and we hear a sermon, I believe that our responsibility is to go back into the word and see if what, the pastor said matches with what God says in his word. So if whatever the scholars are saying doesn't match with what the words say, then I don't think we can trust it. But if it does, then, then we can.
I like that. That's really fundamental, Mariana. Thank you. And as we really meditate on the scriptures and we learn to love them, there becomes to be something that resonates deeply within us. And we hear, oh, that's a little off. That's not quite the real thing. It's like a bank teller. And they handle so many bank bills that when they get one that's a phony, they can feel it. And the same is true. The more and better we know his word, the more we get to trust what's true. At the same time, we need to be open to understanding that sometimes some understandings that we have of particularly the most ancient documents, we want to understand the heart of what it's teaching. But there may be new ways of interpreting it as literature. So scholarship has something to teach us. We need to be open nonetheless. But that's a whole big subject, and probably you'll get to that in one of the other classes. But thank you, Mariana. Let me just go on here. Erasmus, in his terms of his personal philosophy, seemed to believe that Christianity was above all a decent, moderate, and balanced life, a simple life, where passion was subject to the rule of reason. And though he didn't reject Christian doctrine, he remained orthodox in his beliefs all his life. He did insist that the way a person behaved was more important than what he believed, and frequently attacked clergy whose doctrine was impeccable and had perfect, for the Catholic Church, perfect doctrine, but their lives were a shambles. That's almost worth a discussion right there, which is more important, a person's life or their doctrine. I'd be interested in your ideas on it, but I think we're going to have to move ahead here a little bit. But he said, what good is it to be outwardly sprinkled with holy water if one is filthy within? It sounds a little like Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees, isn't it? You got it all right, you Pharisees, your doctrines, but your life is, you're whitewashed tombs. Those are always questions we have to ask. I have my doctrines right, but I hate people? Or I'm cruel to people? Or I badmouth people? Or I do all sorts of immoral things? Yeah, but I got my doctrine right. Well, let's be careful of that. Anyway, this was where Erasmus was settled. So we come now to the reform itself. And I'm wondering if someone might like to summarize for me what you think. If so many people and scholars were looking around and saying, what a mess, this needs to be reformed, what do you think would be some of the major roadblocks to Reformation actually occurring? What do you think? What's going to stop it? I mean, isn't it self-evident? Let's just all do a Reformation. Yeah, Matt.
Well, number one would be pride, because the church would be prideful, saying, we've had it right. We've had it right. You guys are just mixing it up. We're right, you're not.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's that.
Yes, pride, huge. That's huge, pride. Inability to accept something new or a change. I have done it this way all my life. I don't want to change. No way. Tim, what were you going to say? I think I saw you on the edge of the screen here.
Well, power, because they have so much wealth, so much power, so much, and combined with pride especially, they're not going to want to change. I mean, already people don't like changing.
Yeah.
And when you think you're right and when you have power, I mean, yeah, you're not going to change. And especially since I have a feeling a lot of the times people weren't really concerned about being right, more about the power thing.
It is such a good comment, power. That's hugely important. There's some interesting books being written today by psychologists that talk a lot about motivation and how our reason is like the tail of a dog. The dog wags his tail and you see that tail wagging is reason. It's what's you're hearing, it's what you're seeing, but it's the dog who's wagging it, and the dog is our emotions. So that we make decisions instantaneously when we hear, particularly in the political field today, when we hear an idea, we instantly make a decision at the level of our emotions, and then we use our reason to justify it. Now, we can find any number of reasons, but it's our desire, where we want to go, that tells our reason what to say. That's a huge reason. And power is part of that. I'm going to lose power. Oh, no. Yeah, Matt, did you want to say something else? No, you're just playing with your
Yeah.
computer? Yeah, go ahead.
And as you just said, politics, well, politics would be part of it too.
Yes.
Because not just the power, but also in connection with the church connection with the crown, each monarchy, there was a tight connection. And if the Roman Catholic Church goes down, oftentimes the crown would go down as well.
Good thought. Really important. I'm going to get to that in a minute because a lot of times the vested power in the church also supported the crown. Really good thought. Let's get back to that. And I'd like just to show you what I've summarized as a few of the reasons for the resistance to reform. What's going to create a problem? First is the wealth of the church. In Germany, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all lands and wealth were owned by the Roman Catholic Church. 1/3 to 1/2. In France, 3/4 of all French lands and wealth were owned by the church. 3/4. In Italy, 1/3 of Italy belonged to the Pope as sovereign of the Papal States. He controlled many rich properties in the rest of the peninsula. Yeah, Matt.
And that explains why the founders of the United States did not want a single church, a single religion.
That's also part of it. Yeah, those guys studied their history. They knew it. They did not want the church to be in charge. Many of these lands and wealth were normally free of taxation, except to the Pope. You know, he got the taxes from them. The princes and the kings received very little. Another reason is immorality. This kind of wealth and power, this protection from criticism or prosecution, led to moral abuse of all kinds. Monks and friars would neglect their religious services, often spending their time in drunkenness and debauchery. Erasmus wrote, "Many convents of men and women differ little from public brothels." And again, he said, among laymen, the title of clerk or priest or monk is a term of bitter insult. Isabella of Castile wrote on November 20th, 1500, "The immorality is such that the souls entrusted to the clergy receive great damage, for we are told that the majority of the clergy are living in open concubinage, that is, they had all had concubines, and that if our justice intervenes in order to punish them, they revolt and create a scandal, and that they despise our justice to the point that they are themselves against it." Pope Leo X wrote in 1516, "The lack of rule in the monasteries of France and the immodest life of the monks have come to such a pitch that neither kings, princes, nor the faithful at large have any respect left for them." In Germany, nearly all the priests had concubines. In Rome, it was assumed that a priest would have a concubine. Why don't they just let them marry? That would have been simpler. There was a papal envoy sent to reform Benedictine monasteries in France who reported in 1503, "Many monks gamble, curse, haunt inns, carry swords, gather riches, fornicate, live in the life of bacchanals, and are more worldly than the mere worldling." Were I minded to relate all of these things that have come under my own eyes, I should make too long a tale of it. Simony. What was simony again? Do you remember, Grace, what simony is? Sorry to call on you for something so precise, but.
I don't really remember fully what it is, but it had to do with like buying things.
Yes, buying things. Remember Simon Magus in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, what he tried to buy from Peter. And this was
Oh, yeah.
in Samaria. Yeah.
Didn't he try to like purchase, like he wanted to have like the power of the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, he wanted to give money for that. Just give me, I'll give you all this money, and then I want the power of the Holy Spirit to come on people too. And Peter said, keep your money and may it perish with you. You know, and he called him something. And he said, if you don't repent, you are going to be out of it. You're not going to be saved. So Simon became known. This was related to this Simon in Magus in Samaria. And this was anyone that would use money to buy an ecclesiastical post. Well, the thing is that cardinals, who are rarely appointed for their theological ability or Christian piety, could exchange large gifts or political connections in order to have these posts. And the guy who later became Pope Julius II had at one time possessed one archbishopric, 7 bishoprics, and 2 abbeys, and he got all of the income from them. And this allowed the rich to buy other ecclesiastical posts. So here's the deal. This meant that important posts were usually not held by lovers of Christ, but by ambitious people who had vested interests in keeping the status quo. If you reform this, they're not going to have money any longer, or their posts. Not only that, but in France, where the kings appointed bishops and archbishops, and in France they had that power, they got a huge amount, the kings got a huge amount of money by keeping the status quo. They needed that money so that these people could buy their archbishoprics and bishoprics and so forth. And they gave them directly to the king. So they would be against reform. Now the Curia, that's was the official church administrative court in Rome, fixed a certain fee for each service rendered. That was canon law. You know, if you had a service that needed to be rendered, you had a fee. But the actual cost due to greed of the administrative staff was 20 times what it was supposed to be. Everywhere money was needed to get things done. Everywhere, kings and merchants complained of the drain of money from their lands into Roman coffers and monasteries. So maybe that might remind you of something. Oh, I've taken many trips to Mali, Africa, and I know a lot about Africa, but there's something about third world nations. Everywhere you go, there's something called baksheesh. That is bribery, corruption, or tips, that money that's given in order to get some service. Well, I might say one thing. If you really want to get it done, you have to give some baksheesh to the policeman or to the official, and you'll have to go all the way up the hierarchy giving money until you can get it done. That doesn't happen in America, or very little, or in Western Europe today. But at the time, it was completely inundating the Roman Church. So our Europe used to be the way a lot of third world countries are today. They were the same. Something changed to make our nation and Europe different. And finally, there were theological fears. People, even scientists today, can be resistant to change. I think, Matt, you're the one who said it. They hang on to what they know. I love this little statement. It's so helpful. It says, all change is experienced as loss and reacted to with anger. Even if you're telling people, all you need to do is look at the Lord Jesus Christ and believe in him sincerely from the heart. Accept him into your heart, you'll be saved. Even that great good news can be reacted to with anger because you experienced, wait a second, I've done all these things. Penance, gone on pilgrimages, saved all this money to buy my post. I like the system the way it is. Forget this. All change is experienced as loss and reacted to with anger. There's a lot of psychological things going on here too. So it's not surprising that nearly everyone saw the need for reform, nor that Erasmus's satires of the church were bestsellers, but how to go about reform when there's so many vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Where do you begin? So where would you begin? What would you do? We've got a few minutes here. Let's think about that a second. What would you do? I don't know, I should make this the embedded question or not. Yeah. Where would you begin if you or someone are concerned about the state of the church? What to do? Boy, I don't often ask you a question where you're all a little dumbfounded by it. What do you think, Liz? You're back there hiding, I know.
So, like, you're asking if we were in favor of the Reformation?
If you lived in that day, you're concerned about all you saw, the corruption, the simony, immorality, the theological things that just weren't right. Where would you begin and why?
I think I would begin with creating I guess, kind of like a support group, start spreading what I have found, either the truth of what I have found, writings, just making it available for as many people as I can, people who are also looking for answers and for truth, and then begin from there, because with all of these powers against the Reformation, it would be quite difficult to try to face them alone, and try to stand up to them as a single person when it's like a whole government of people who will probably go after me because I'm trying to take basically everything they've built, with a single idea, a powerful one, but one person could not really do it by themselves. So yeah, I would start there with spreading the truth about it and trying to open people's eyes.
I like that. So in other words, you're going to start with truth, writing. Get it out there in writing. Truth. Yeah, Timothy.
I think I would try to find, I think you mentioned there was a cardinal in, was it France, that started really going against the Catholic Church because he realized like, oh, this and this are wrong. And I'm trying to remember who that was, but I think we talked about it recently.
Well, there was John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. There was
yeah, it might have been them.
Peter Waldo. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would start by trying to find people like that seek the truth and not power. Just get to know them, get to like find those people out in the community, because there's definitely people like that. And well, assuming I've got good evidence, which I figure I do, then I would go and bring it to them and be like, hey, here's what I have seen from what I've read, from what I've understood about all of this. Like, we don't have support for all of these things that we're doing. I see all of these things wrong here, and just explain it to them in that same truthful manner and get some of those people who will actually listen to the truth on my side and start working together. I think that goes good with Liz's idea too, to do both of those at the same time.
So you're dovetailing a lot with what Mariana had said, and it reminds me what Jesus said, you will know the truth. The truth will set you free. what we know in our minds and hearts just starts spreading into every other area. Anybody else want to share a word? What do you think? Where would you begin? Go ahead, Matt.
I agree with Liz that you'd start to do the printing of things first, but I think the best place to start is the immorality slash the simony, because simony allows immorality, and just linking those two together and writing about those two in specific would point out a major hole of corruption in the church, and and most likely start to change minds.
Yeah. Okay, so you would really want to put your finger on something that's a major moral issue that relates to wealth and immorality. Let people know. Maybe that can begin to cause people to think, wait, there's something wrong here. I'm open to some new ideas too. Maybe that's the door that opens up to a change. When Luther went down to Rome, he was deeply shaken by what he saw as a young monk there. It might well have opened up his thinking process too. Got exposed to the hypocrisy of it. Good thoughts. So let me, we'll just make that the embedded question. If anybody has anything else they want to say about that, you can answer it, or you could answer the last question if we get to it. But here we are. Theologians were sensing things were wrong. Scholars were sensing things were wrong. Many people, just to take one example, were wondering whether anyone, not to mention immoral priests, could change bread and wine into the actual body and blood of our Lord. So that was another thing that just kind of jarred people. So, oh, wait a second, these immoral priests and things, they're changing this into bread and wine into the actual body. And even if they're not, can they really do that? And about the year 1510 or 11, this man, Johannes Geiler of Strasbourg, at the time it was a German-speaking city. Strasbourg as a cathedral exists to this day. And Strasbourg is a center of a lot of European stuff in the European Union today. Johann Geiler said this, and he died in 1511. So this is before Luther. For Luther did put his theses on in 1517. He was 70 years old, this guy, Johann Geiler, and he was a great preacher, one of the last great preachers of the Middle Ages. And he said this, and I think maybe I've written this. Since neither Pope nor Emperor, kings nor bishops will reform our life, God will send a man for the purpose. I hope to see that day. But I am too old. Many of you will see it. Think then, I pray you, of these words. So he was saying, this seems so impossible to reform. Some reform has to go. God's going to send a man. He's going to send a man. I pray I would see it, but I am too old to. And of course, God did send that man, and he sent it in the person of Martin Luther. And here he is, and we're going to talk about him next Thursday, or on Thursday. Martin Luther was the guy God used. Wow, what a figure. Oftentimes called the most powerful and important figure in human history since Jesus. And we're going to talk about him next week. We actually have 3 minutes And so I thought I'd read a little something to you. And it's called Julius Exclusus. And that means Julius, and they're talking about Pope Julius II, excluded. He died in 1513 at the age of 70. This is delightful. Somebody wants to write a paper on this. You'll find it online. Julius Exclusus is written by Erasmus. It's quite long, but Julius finds himself at the gates of heaven, Pope Julius. And he keeps pounding on the gates. And Peter finally comes and said, who is this trying to get in? And he can't get in. Pope can't get in. This is Erasmus saying this. And he's accompanied by a kind of an angel who's called his genius. Here's an excerpt. Peter, when I look over from head to foot, I see many signs of impiety and none of holiness. What's the meaning of these many comrades of yours? They're certainly not a papal retinue. You have almost 20,000 men at your back. And in this entire crowd, I can't find one single individual who is so much as the face of a Christian. I see a horrifying mob of ruffians reeking of nothing but brothels, booze shops, and gunpowder. They look to me like plain highway robbers or spooks stolen out of a hell, and now intent on stirring up wars in heaven. As for yourself, the more I look at you, the fewer traces I see of any apostolic character. What sort of unnatural arrangement is it that while you wear the robes of a priest of God, under them you are dressed in the bloody armor of a warrior? Besides that, what a savage pair of eyes, what baleful features, what a menacing brow, what a disdainful and arrogant expression. I'm ashamed to say, and even to see, that there's no part of your body not marked with traces of outrageous and abominable lust. In addition, you belch and stink like a man just come from a drunken debauch and fresh from a fit of vomiting. Judging from the appearance of your whole body, you seem to me not worn out by age or disease, but broken down and shriveled up by drunken excesses. Isn't that interesting? I think that this is fun reading, not only because the guy uses such colorful language and is so clear, Erasmus, but it gives you an insight in what people thought of the Pope today. We don't dare use language like that Erasmus did. And unfortunately, it was all too true. I had a lot more I could read, but let's just end there. If you don't like the previous question, no, I won't give you this last question, but well, yeah. Tell me about it. Do you think someone like Julius should be excluded from heaven, even though he believed in Christ? What are your thoughts? You might prefer that question over the previous one. And Tim, that's actually, we're kind of overtime now, but yeah, I guess you can say that. You can say something if you want, except you're giving away the answer to all the rest of the students, you know, who are reading and listening to this. Go ahead.
All I'm thinking of is a Bible.
Matt, it's Tim who was first to raise her hand. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I can't see.
Got you, man. Well, I'll just make it really short, but I just hope you did anyway, because when you think about what hell is supposed to be, I don't think you should wish that on anyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
So what I was going to say is, reminds me of a Bible verse. All their works were burned, hay or stubble, and their works were burned up. Yet were they saved, yet as by fire.
Interesting. You guys are very compassionate people, and I hope the Lord is compassionate. Bless you. We'll see you next Thursday. I know the Lord is compassionate, but we'll see you next Thursday. Bye now.
Mr. Kaplan.
Yeah, Liz.
Mariana got kicked out a few times because her internet is kind of, it just cuts her off. So she just wanted to let you know that. She didn't leave. It just kicked her out.
I appreciate that, Liz. Thank you. I appreciate all you guys. Love you. Bye.
Bye.